Professor Gabriel Motzkin, Dr. Shimshon Zelniker, members of the Board of Trustees, past and present researchers and staff of the Van-Leer Jerusalem Institute, dear guests, it's a pleasure and an honor for me, on behalf of the Board, to say welcome to you tonight. I will come back to you with some comments about this evening, but first I want to give the word to our Executive Director, Professor Gabriel Motzkin. Please.
Good evening and welcome. In our ritual calendar, the Oscar Van-Leer Lecture is one of our most important celebrations, one in which we affirm our highest esteem for someone whose presence has enlightened us all. I would like to use this opportunity to talk about the person whom we are honoring in a personal way, to talk about the special quality of this person. Now, if we are called to talk about someone we know, we will each tell our own story about that person. Nonetheless, when each of us in turn seeks to describe someone, we often do recognize that we are indeed talking about the same individual. I want to use this opportunity to talk about my experience of the person you are about to hear, in the hope that the many of you who know him well will recognize my description. I first met Shimshon Zelniker when he came to the Van-Leer Institute in 1997. I remember this tall man with an inexhaustible curiosity for the finest details, a man who was avid to know everything he could about an individual's life, social context, and cultural embeddedness. What was remarkable was his openness, his push to expand horizons, and the way he opened up this institute. Shimshon has a hunger for life, for meeting people all over the world and finding out what makes them tick. You will be amazed at how many places he has been, and you will be invigorated by the intelligence and the energy with which he communicates what he has learned from others. At that time, close to 10 years ago, I directed the Franz Rosenzweig Center for German Jewish Literature and Cultural Studies. Shimshon and I did some things together. I remember especially a 1999 conference on Rembrandt and the Jews, where we brought together German, Jewish, and Dutch scholars to talk about Rembrandt's reception. Now, you may not have imagined that Rembrandt was a central person in Shimshon's Weltanschauung. How vividly I remember Shimshon's opening remarks at that conference, how he succeeded in framing the central intellectual issues, and especially the way in which Shimshon made the participants feel comfortable with their participation in this unique conference, in this unique building. Over the next few years, we had many discussions and often went to dinner together, and I always sensed that same vitality and openness, that same interest in others that had been like a fresh breath of fresh air from the moment he entered Van-Leer. Now, Shimshon has retired from Van-Leer. I wonder what that means, what retirement could possibly signify in the case of someone like Shimshon. I picture him roving our world in the quest for unnoticed perspectives. He will apply the great judiciousness with which he is blessed to ever novel situations. In his time at the Institute, he served it well as its ambassador at large to a wider world. He always looked for bridges between the work done here and the myriad preoccupations that inform our society. Perhaps it is time to reverse the direction of this relationship. I hope that when Shimshon travels through our many and diverse social contexts, he will bring back to us the originality and creativity of his take on the experience he has garnered, so that we will continue to be nourished by his discriminating sensitivity to the constant process of social self-renewal taking place outside of our four walls. You will hear him tonight offering us the fruit of his reflections on his experience with truth and reconciliation. Keep in mind, while you listen to him, that for Shimshon there is never any thought about what he has experienced that is not also directed to the future. So it is with affection and a sense of privilege that I look forward to our lecture tonight.
Ladies and gentlemen, as chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Van-Leer Jerusalem Institute, it is always an honor to stand at this podium. Likewise, it is also always a great honor to deliver opening remarks on the evening of the Oscar Van-Leer Memorial Lecture. The late Oscar Van-Leer, as so many have said, played an active and assertive role in carrying out the vision of his mother, the late Polly Van-Leer, who founded this institute 50 years ago. In December 1994, the Board of Trustees of the Van-Leer Jerusalem Institute established an annual lecture in honor of Oscar Van-Leer's 80th birthday, and since his death in 1996, the annual lectures have continued in his memory on a biannual basis. As one long affiliated with the developments and achievements of the Van-Leer Jerusalem Institute, this evening offers me another fitting opportunity to express pride in its achievements this year as we celebrate its 50th jubilee anniversary. I will refrain from elaborating on the achievements in research and scholarly study, publications, public events, and impact on Israeli society that the Institute has had and continues to have. Yet it is only appropriate to note that Dr. Shimshon Zelniker, who stood at the head of this institute for the past 10 years until September 1 of this year, played a major role in its growth and development. With dedication and commitment to the vision and values at the core of this institute over the past 10 years with hard work and determination. Dr. Zelniker led the institute into many of the areas of major concern on the public agenda locally and with implications for those looking at Israel and its interests from abroad. Thus, it is a special honor in the Jubilee year of this institute as we convene for the 9th Oscar Van-Leer Memorial Lecture to call upon Dr. Zelniker to deliver the lecture this evening. He follows a long and impressive line of prominent scholars and public figures who have delivered the lectures over the years. Among them, Professor Haim Hari, Professor Avishai Braverman, and Professor Daniel Kahneman, just to mention a few. Dr. Zelniker, your headline is, as we heard before, Reflections on Intractable Conflicts and Reconciliation, South Africa, Northern Ireland, and United States. I wish you all a very interesting evening and say welcome to Dr. Zell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the very kind words, Gabi. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to do the It is indeed a great honor to be here tonight as the 9th speaker in the Oscar Van-Leer lecture series. The series, as you just heard, was instituted by my predecessors as a tribute to a person who, together with his mother, Miss Polly Van-Leer, symbolizes the spirit of the Institute. Oscar Van-Leer's commitment to intellectual excellence, to freedom of thought, and to decent civic democracy has been the guiding force of this institute during its last 50 years, its 50 years of existence. Everything that was achieved here is imbued with his legacy and indomitable personality. I certainly am proud to be a part of this tradition and a part of this legacy. I want to thank the trustees of the Van-Leer Group Foundations who are here with us this evening. I want to especially welcome Andre Betting, the new executive director of the Group Foundation. I want to extend my welcome to the new and old members of the board of the VLJI. And I am particularly happy to extend my thanks and acknowledgement to an old member of the VLGF who had come especially for this evening, Mr. Pet Risch, a friend, a colleague, and an inspiration. Esteemed colleagues, dear guests from far and near, ladies and gentlemen, Morai v'Rabotai. The topic I chose for my talk this evening is intractable conflict and reconciliation. I wanted to be sure about the precise meaning of the term intractable, and so I went and looked it up at the full Random House dictionary. The word was attractive, but I wasn't sure about it. Well, the definition that it offered are: 1, intractable, not docile, stubborn, obstinate. 2, hard to shape or work with, unmanageable. 3, resisting treatment or cure. And lastly, perverse, headstrong, dogged, obdurate, unending, and inflexible, almost like an unliked relative. Intractable conflicts, then, are a type of a conflict that is deadlier than others, more destructive than others, and the least given to management, containment, or reconciliation than others. The obvious question that comes to mind here is, do intractable conflicts ever end? Or can they ever be sorted out peacefully? This is, of course, a question that we here ought to be asking ourselves all the time. This is not a trivial question, and it is made even more critical in light of the alarming proliferation of extremely violent, complex, and seemingly endless conflicts in the last decades. In their recent study of conflict, Marshall and Gore tell us that in 2005, there were some 20 major armed conflicts that were waged around the globe. This is not to mention another 130 not major wars that were taking place at the same time. Some of these major wars were interstate wars and others internal wars. 40% of the intrastate armed conflicts endured for more than 10 years, and 25 of all the wars lasted for more than 25 years. Cases of sustained violence then can be found everywhere, from East Africa, where the southern Sudan and Somali crises continue to fester and claim hundreds of thousands of lives, to East and Central Asia, to Latin America, the Balkans, and not least, of course, in our immediate region. Internal wars, insurgencies, revolutionary wars, or your plain old-fashioned international campaigns are raging with ferocity that defies easy solution or explanation. Of the growing variety of conflict situations, I chose to focus my discussion on the situation in South Africa and on North Ireland because, together with our own local conflict, these have become the conventional benchmark, the model of intractability. There is also the obvious personal reason for the choice, since I was born into the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and was thrust repeatedly by fate and career into the other two conflicts. But leaving the personal dimension aside, what is so special about these cases? What singles them out as intractable conflicts? Historically, all three cases were conceived in British colonial sin. In Ireland, the sin dates back to the year 1801, with the British takeover of the entire Irish island, and more particularly from 1921 with the partition of the island into North and South. In South Africa, it dates back to the late 17th century, and the institution, first by the Dutch East India Company and later by the British and Afrikaner government, of a system of racial separation and domination that we know as apartheid. All three cases have endured then over a very long period of time, during which violence has escalated steadily without showing any signs of abating or ending. It is three cases, these are three cases where violence is continuously on the rise, or was on the rise. In addition, all three cases were driven by primordial forces such as race or ethnicity, especially in the case of South Africa, by religion or confessional ethnicity, enmity, as in Northern Ireland and closer at home in Lebanon, for instance, or by deep nationalist sentiments and ideologies which offer conflate race, religion, and class divisions and prolong and deepen conflict. All our cases became intractable because the primordial forces that triggered the conflicts in the first place were conveniently fixed and self-perpetuated. Over the long haul, the conflicts were gradually woven into the very fabric, the socio-psychological fabric of the feuding societies, and became their identity definers. In all three conflicts, we can easily identify an overbearing sense of moral superiority and self-righteousness. Self-righteousness which drove both sides of the conflict and tended to perpetuate it. What I mean here is that the sides to the dispute define their causes as holy mission or holy wars. They view it as an end much worthier than any materialistic interest, and one which they are willing to kill and die for rather than compromise on. The very notion of compromise in intractable conflicts, any compromise becomes unethical and therefore totally objectionable. It's very difficult to say whether I'm describing the three sui generic or similar cases, or whether what I'm saying really is part of a very large list of identifying marks. I can tell you, though, that after going into this topic, I found studies that list more than 70 essential factors that make for intractable conflicts. I'm not interested in all of them. I enumerate what I think is very critical to our case. Connected to the above, I should point out that moral self-righteousness and the perception of the other as morally inferior offers a license to deal with the inferior other in cruel, inhuman, and sometimes criminal ways, while justifying this conduct on so-called moral grounds. This has been the case in all of the three conflicts that we're dealing with, and it may be typical of others as well. Finally, to round it off, all three conflicts were and are characterized by what I regard as a psychology of siege and victimhood. I'm not even sure whether the noun victimhood is proper English. I am sure, however, that the sentiment which this term is meant to convey served as a potent force which added to the intractability and violence of all three conflicts. I may at this point find it proper to venture and say, or venture a view that I hold, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has long become a contest where the two sides seem more concerned about securing the high moral ground of the victim than they are about winning other, much more conventional strategic objectives. This brief list of defining characteristics is, as I said, by no means exhaustive, nor is it an attempt at a theory of conflict, although we need one very clearly and urgently. The need is there because the contemporary conflicts seem to defy all definitions of war and traditional rules of engagement. They do not conform to the Westphalia model of war with its clearly defined sovereign adversaries and with their strict codes of conduct. The conflicts that we are dealing with here are what Mark Duffield called new wars. They are unrestrained conflicts that are waged by privatized or private armed forces and are conducted, quote unquote, beyond the regulatory regimes that were formerly associated with the nation state. Without becoming too theoretical here, one thing is clear. Today's intractable conflicts are waged by a wide variety of players who show little regard to territoriality and sovereignty, and whose perceptions of time, cost, and victory differ fundamentally from those held by the nation state. The ubiquity of armed conflicts and their changing character has led some students of the field to take a new look at the political and, more importantly, at the ethical meaning and consequences of such conflicts. Breaking away from the conventional view of conflict as a pathology, as a malady that can be treated, cured, or altogether prevented, these new approaches accept conflict and war as an integral, healthy part of the social structure, rather than as a pathology, of course. They maintain that war and armed conflicts can be quite instrumental for social and political renewal and for innovation. In the words of one such specialist, war is an ever-present axis around which opposing societies measure themselves and reorder social and economic and political life. Clearly, then, the view of conflict as a dangerous abnormality seems to have given way to a much more tolerant approach that sees conflict as an agent of change and development, even if it comes at the expense of the international order or the integrity of existing sovereign states. I leave it to you to calculate, the meaning of this equation. But in any event, in sum, what we see here is a clear diminution in the value of the modern 20th century state institution as we know it, and an expressed skepticism, outright skepticism, about the utility and moral wisdom of efforts to save it, the state, from conflict and other challenges. It may be a bit too early to start mourning the disappearance of the nation state or to welcome conflict as an unmitigated virtue. There is, however, a great deal to be said in favor of viewing conflict as a dynamic and a vital political process that can take place outside the framework of the state or in direct opposition to it. Now, let me turn now to South Africa and Northern Ireland and review, thank you very much, and review very briefly the critical issues which underlay both and the dynamics that eventually brought them to a peaceful end. As I pointed just a few minutes ago, all three cases have a shared colonial British origin. In Northern Ireland, the conflict was unleashed by Britain's refusal to relinquish control over the northern, mainly Protestant part of the Irish island. The rest, and by far the larger part of the island, was ceded by Britain to the Irish Catholic majority in the area which after 1921 went on to become the independent Republic of Ireland. The partition, like all partitions, and we have gone through it in our own private histories, the partition, like all partitions, created a significant Catholic minority in the north, which never accepted British sovereignty and fought with the full moral and political backing from the Republican government in the south to stop the British rule and unify the island. What emerged was a composite, violent conflict which was fraught with religious, nationalist, and class tensions, and where both Catholics and Protestants viewed themselves as minorities at risk. This is one of the great achievements of British colonialism. In parting a country equitably or unequitably between two parties, they created two minority groups rather than a majority and a minority. Both the Protestants and the Catholics viewed and continued to view themselves as beleaguered minorities at risk. The practical control over the conflict that erupted was taken over very rapidly by the extreme fringes on both sides of the conflict. Both became increasingly less inhibited in their choice of tactics and were inattentive to the wishes of the communities which they claimed to be representing. With their proclivity to extremist politics, it took little time for the conflict to devolve into open violence to the exclusion of most other forms of communication. Whereas this description can fit the events in many other conflict areas, there is one important element that singles out this particular case. In Northern Ireland, Catholics and Protestants did not fight for political autonomy or independence. Quite the contrary. Their struggle was for inclusion or incorporation within the boundaries of an outside sovereign state, Catholics in the Irish Republic and Protestants in Britain. Now, the dependence on outside patrons had little effect on the levels of violence and the intransigence which characterized the conflict for the better part of the century. The British and Irish governments were either content to go along or powerless to stop the drift of their clients' demands, and were sucked willy-nilly into a situation where control over policy-making devolved to the most extreme fringe among the fighting militias. The result was that the mounting level of violence, the inflammatory rhetoric, and the stubborn refusal to publicly back away from the idea of victory defined both patrons and clients' behavior throughout most of the conflict. Pardon me. Conflicts dry you out. It was only towards the end that the presence of outside patrons, I'm talking about Northern Ireland, it is only towards the end of the process that the presence of Britain and the Irish Republic came to play a role. But it did so only at the point of terminating the conflict in Ireland, not in managing and steering it systematically towards compromise. The maturation of the idea of compromise in Ireland came from below in a manner similar to the process in South Africa and hopefully here. The disenchantment with the violent nature of the struggle started not in London, not in Dublin. It started at a community level where the mounting toll in human life, more than 4,000 dead in 30 years, the escalating cruelty, and the randomness of terror turned a growing cross-section of the local population away from the fighting militias and eventually isolated the extremes. The steady mobilization of civil society and the growing volume of civic demands for peaceful alternatives was a critical development in the evolution of Northern Ireland. And it had an impact. It did have an impact on both the patrons and on world public opinion. Evidence of this impact, which the grassroots pressures was able to bring to bear, came in the mid-70s when the Nobel Prize for Peace was awarded to one Irish peace NGO. But for all the obvious changes of attitudes on both sides, it took nearly 30 years for the idea of compromise to ripen. The first major attempt to reach compromise, the Anglo-Irish Agreement, came in 1985, and this agreement laid down the basic principles of a settlement, but it failed to hold. It failed to take root. And it was another 15 years later after that agreement, with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, that violence was finally brought to a halt. Seen from our perspective, the 1998 Good Friday Agreement must be regarded as a major achievement. But we should remember that the agreement may have ended the violence, but it did not as yet produce a final status agreement to settle the fate of the North beyond the ceasefire. Now, there are people here that understand and know Northern Ireland much better than I do, and it is the proper place to say that in drawing the picture both of South Africa and North Ireland, I allowed myself, a poetic license and skirted around a lot of, issues that may be pertinent. What I was trying to say, and will say again, in the context of North Ireland and South Africa, is the change started at the bottom from grassroots levels on. Now, in South Africa, the presence and influence of external patrons was not available. It did not moderate Afrikaner national objectives, which were defined with little regard to world opinion and with even less regard to African collective needs. There was no outside influence to moderate white nationalism, which fed on a peculiar combination of existential fears, cultural isolation, and a sense of racial superiority. This explosive mix of fear and ideology produced a system of government which was designed to prevent African and to a large extent English-speaking communities access to power. This was bound to set off, as indeed it did, a chain reaction of violence and counter-violence. The spiral of violence started in the 60s after a surprisingly long and tame African reaction to brutal racial oppression, disenfranchisement, and economic exclusions. Things became more radicalized only after it became absolutely and abundantly clear that constitutional means, political protest, legal action, and international pressures had little effect on white attitudes and policies. The African decision in 1961 to take up an armed struggle as a new approach to social change seemed equally ineffective, at least in the short term. It forced the conflict into a new and quite violent stage, which peaked in the mid-1980s into an open urban guerrilla warfare. White reactions to this new African strategy were brutal and undeterred by the growing international involvement that was started to being exerted from the outside. The government's reading of the situation was simple. This was a war for Afrikaner white national survival, and it will be waged to the bitter end. Any notion of compromise, whether territorial or electoral, was dismissed as a transparent plot to end white domination. This blunt rejection of compromise left the conflict in violent limbo and produced an avalanche of analyses predicting catastrophe as the only likely end to the conflict. The term which was actually used at the time was bloodbath, and it was deemed absolutely inescapable within less than 30 years. Well, as we all know, this doomsday scenario did not materialize, and in less than 15 years after the predictions of disasters were made, Mandela was set free, and an intractable conflict ended just like that, with minimal obvious political bargaining and with hardly any resistance from the hardcore verkramptes extremes in the white community. Now, the easy way to explain the South African reconciliation, if this was what happened there, is to point out to de Klerk and Mandela. These two heroes, like Sadat in Jerusalem or Nixon in China, are popularly seen as the charismatic leaders who, by sheer force of personality, averted disaster and reshaped history. I don't want to sound irreverent here, but I would have to say that no matter how significant charismatic leadership may be, charisma is no substitute for genuine political process. Charismatic leaders can expedite, can hurry the process of reconciliation, but they cannot kickstart it or serve as a substitute for one. This was certainly the case with Mandela and de Klerk. Both played a decisive role in designing the transition to formal reconciliation and constitutional politics, but their entry into the actual process of political self-correction and self-adjustment came rather late in the process, which in 1987-90, when the negotiations took place, was already well underway. An irony which I would like to point out and which many observers miss is the fact that the secret meetings between apartheid regime and Mandela were not conducted by de Klerk, but by P.W. Botha, one of the most reactionary of South Africa's politicians. The actual meetings started nearly 5 years before de Klerk was even elected to office and were conducted without his knowledge or involvement at the time. If we do away with charisma, what then do we have? The process, in my opinion, which led to the eventual peace and reconciliation began to form not in secret meetings, but in the field, just like in Northern Ireland. In the field where government was steadily losing its control over the township and physically pulling its forces out of the African location. The government was beaten. By the early 1980s, in the midst of the most violent occurrences which inclined observers to fear and predict a bloodbath, the townships were already controlled by cadres of local black leaders who were backed up by a massive net of community-based organizations, street committees, women, and youth groups. Inspired by this new, very active leadership, the black township residents stopped paying rents, stopped paying taxes, boycotted white shops, and shut down nearly the entire educational system. The regime's presence in the township was reduced to periodic police raids which only incited violence rather than contain it. In effect, then, at the very time when the experts were impressed by the determination and force with which the regime was seemingly choking off the lifelines to the township, the regime and white domination were actually beginning to slip. The de facto withdrawal of security forces from the townships was simply an expedient official adjustment to the fact that government was losing power in the African urban centers. In short, for all its seeming aggression, the deployment patterns of the security forces, and this happens in all cases that you may be familiar with, the deployment patterns of the security forces in major African urban centers reflected an early indication of regime weakness and regime awakening. It is important to stress the fact that what we have in South Africa is a subtle but unmistakable process of self-correction and self-adjustment, which is a precursor of official negotiations. This is the critical proposition that I like to offer to you. It is a precursor of official negotiations. This process, may go through stages marked by formal attempts to articulate the changing conditions, or it may benefit from outside intervention, which is designed to hasten the process. In South Africa, this was not the case. They had no Oslo, they had no Genevas, they had no Trek 2 meetings in which the sides attempted to negotiate a way out of the conflict. What we have in South Africa, more than 20 years before any mention of direct negotiations, is a series of unilateral policy concessions that went to the very heart of apartheid and transformed it completely, whilst the fight to preserve the system in toto went on with great vigor and cost. I will not, and I cannot go into the details of the concessions that were made in 20 years. But I do want to stress one important thing. The meaning and eventual significance of these concessions, and I'm talking about South Africa, but I have in mind Israel, I have in mind Palestine, I have in mind North Ireland. The importance of these informal concessions, the significance of these concessions, is always obscured, and it is obscured for quite a long while, by the continued violence that defines conflict and by government official pronouncements. What we look at is government official declarations. What we see is violence. Violence and government official intentions obscure the fact that what is going on is a unilateral, self-adjusting process. Let me repeat it so I don't lose my... These concessions, I say, were obscured for quite a long while by the continued violence that defined the conflict and by government's official pronouncements that continued to deny any intention of compromise. Now, in this respect, the South Africa case is not much different from the Palestinian, Israeli, and Irish cases. In all three of them, and probably in others, it is violence which is the salient feature that dominates public perception and not the subtler political, social processes. An equally important similarity that binds our three cases is the fact that the essential principles of an eventual peace agreement are known and officially acknowledged by all sides very early in the process, long before signing agreements. In Northern Ireland, these principles were agreed upon more than 15 years before the Good Friday Agreement, and similarly, the Palestinian-Israeli principle of an agreement have been understood, acknowledged, and even agreed upon repeatedly for more than 25 years. Clearly then, and I want to bring my presentation to an end. Clearly then, in politics, as in private life, understanding the problem does not cure it. The cure in both private and public life does not rest on the knowledge of evidence. The cure, which in our context means the ability to add seemingly intractable conflicts through peaceful means is predicated on a fundamental recognition by both sides that victory, as it was defined at the onset of the conflict, is unachievable, unattainable, and must be redefined. Reconciliation, which you will remember is an element in the title of my speech, reconciliation then, in my opinion, is not reconciliation with the other. It is not a Christian or religious concept. Reconciliation is a gradual process which inclines ever-growing sections of society and ultimately its leadership to face the truth, to face the facts, and reconcile themselves to their own limitations, prejudices, and weakness. It is at this stage that charismatic leaders may play a major role, as the admission of failure requires an exceptional act of leadership. It happened in South Africa, and for a while we believed that it happened here. But were we wrong, or is Annapolis a harbinger of peace to come? Thank you.
I think I, on behalf of everybody, say we are proud of this Oscar Van-Leer lecture, number 9, in 2007. And we are proud and honored when you said, it's an honor for me, you said that I am invited to do it. So I think we should give you a second applause. And that means that Dr. Shimshon Zelniker has qualified for an honorary medal, which is the confirmation of the fact that this has been well done. Thank you. The last task I have here is to say that you are all welcome and invited to a reception down in the hall here, so that you can individually get the detailed explanation from Dr. Sim. Thank you. Thank you for tonight.